Good morning again, Geshe Thabkhe, and also again, welcome Katrina Brooks, our interpreter. Thank you so much.
Oh, did this. Near short, so I'm pushing it in the city. Dollar temperature now, Lamsing against the temp to do Jabaka. Kanda Yanda, then Betunam number kun de not on this one. Near the changes and best such a Sunday can the Dollar charge alone. No, yeah. Tinitaka soda. Oh, Tomatin subject subject to Takas 11 national. Roa. Rangi Tenjogi Milis Sambutobandi. Penny. Make you a shelter and make you a chupa, Kiwachu Sushin the troop. Kiwangamanam so stock will make you a lala give a share. Tenikawachima, Hadami Kova, Nivatovachi, top to a sheet. Tenet Hadam Lada Mi Kovan, Rimge. Nil Hadami Kovan, some to a Maiba. Hadami Kovan, Tungajiran Shinshan Koabe, Roa. Koala led on Yamugi Shama to give a koala chijan tower cha. They are Rachibu, Koyatungele Towers and Mayamba. Padam Madam Yent and Yidu Simja, Sindi Sim Pamagatsube, Simja Tamja Pamamajuba Mebe. Teda Tamja Koyatungele Towers cha. They said to Teda Chenebe. Tada Ran and Niba Yos Soba Menaya. Teda Niba Yos Soba Kunse, Yande Kunte. Yayana, Mishiba Mongbata. Numobas Tamja set. Shamben Bashi. Tagbe Shanji be Chanju Simkulekin. Sanji Yakovan Bushi Jatobar Jasam. Chanju Simya Bush set up. No teacher, they top Jaki Lamtus Yabunyang in Samche. Tobatan Samba Kumbala Juba Shagin Samne. Sambar shoes or teach sooner. Yeah.
So to begin with, like yesterday, as we talked about setting a good motivation, we should think about how right now we have obtained this precious human rebirth, and we are able to right now engage in the practice of abandoning the 10 non-virtues and engage in the 10 virtuous actions, give rise to regret for those previous non-virtues that we have committed. And so doing, we are able to ensure that in the future we can attain rebirth as a human or a god. But in stages, we shouldn't just be satisfied with attaining such a good rebirth, but rather come to recognize and understand that even a good rebirth is still in the nature of suffering. All that is in samsara is in the nature of suffering, and therefore generate this wish to be freed from that cycle of suffering. But it's not just ourselves, not just me who is cycling in this suffering situation, but rather all mother and father sentient beings, all of those that are friends and relatives and loved ones, and all that have acted in that way are also subject to all of these sufferings of samsara. However, right now, I don't have the power, I don't have the ability to be able to fully aid those other sentient beings. And so I wish to attain the state of Buddhahood, wherein I have developed all good qualities and removed all fault, gotten rid of that kind of deluded ignorance and removed it completely and given rise to this strong bodhicitta attitude within a mind stream such that one can attain such a state. And so we should think that with that kind of a motivation, I'm going to listen to these teachings and not only listen to them, but put them into practice for that purpose.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. That, Kaswa. Samalangadu delays, Kindimba, Samalangadu delay. Shenda Sensinaga Samangadu delays. Tachida, my the shed, Kesa sheds are the Yanja, do to share. Geshe, Geshe, and go to dining out in the shed and Mambu Gorgidwa, the more shed in a cursing, Kesa sheds are did something in my window. Oh, yeah. What did you
So,
say?
good morning to all at the Abbey, and good morning as well to all of those others who are listening. Yesterday we had gone through part of the text, and we were going through a bit in detail. So we may start to go a little bit more sort of succinctly with this. So we will then pick up from where we had left off yesterday in the text. This is on 411 in the English.
Oh, yeah, Tandi something dimba. Dame Bangusum to talk with Shirp Chushin Esidwa. Sibale Taji in the Eshe. Dame Usum to talk with Shirp T. Comne, any Shiba Koale Tarachive. Taji tap tambadi Yashud Teres on Guara. Taji in the Yang Sibe Tunge Megibe Kusen Yegi Tap Tamba in Becher. Or Dame Bangusum to talk with Lodi Gomna. Tangzi de Shuchor Church Sandura. Ne Tado Zimbamena, ne Yansiba, Tome Maribe Kunalani, Niban Duchigi Lesa, Tone, Diwangi Kiwaling at some Sandura. Yansibe Tunge, Megibe Kusen, get up down by bitches, or Dame Bangusum to Tobe Shirapte, Sibele Tara Shibe, and Lam so to give at the rest, Dame to Beshira Combalatane, as Sibele Give. Kusengi tap tambai bis. Yang sibe tunge megiwe tap tambai bis. Tunge ke piazawa marikbala neba ki chigardo. Ote sonja. Tene takba tap tambai bisira. Takba la tarche da tarba de kangle kya mite barta. Ta takba ina. Ta takba ina. Rwa. Ta takba da chigbu da rawa tubache. Ane te zimba de yang takba ina. Ngabi nesu da tubache ina. Ne tatakbal yani tungele tarwa cheba da tatakba de tunge gichingbar cheba da tarwa cheba tade teg mare sungora takbala tarje da tarwa de kanle jami tebar tas te jebur me rueches ko tunge genar tunge nyang ya tunge nyang me go chaya de ko jura dogora tele gyuchi gi penne jeba sukora gyuchi gi tunge nyang chu yang chuchi ki tunge le tar chuchi penyon dewa shikuya te takbali penyon ki chawche yoma to penyon dirgi yone ko yura dhugiya to yura dhugiya yone ane mitabari dhugiya ra takbala tarche na tarba di kangle kya mite barta ten debur mirungi chiris o di chi kuna.
So, picking up from where we had left off, it says then, and this is getting at that the wisdom directly realizing no self is what affects liberation from samsaric existence, because it is the supreme method that is the very condition for the non arising of the suffering of further samsaric existence. So, here, by meditating on selflessness, developing that wisdom, directly realizing no self or selflessness, again and again, one is able to extricate from the root, the cause that leads to the sufferings of samsara. So if one gets rid of that fundamental grasping at a self, that ignorance, then one is no longer going to give rise to various afflictions that lead one to accumulate karmic formations and thus go through the process of taking rebirth in samsaric existence. And so, as it says here, it is the supreme method that is the very condition or like the cause for the non-arising of the suffering of further samsaric existence, because it has destroyed that root. This wisdom directly realizing selflessness is able to create the non-arising of the suffering of samsaric existence. And so continuing, it says then, how could a permanent entity be a liberator, or what is liberated? So here, the opponent thinks that there is some kind of a self that is permanent. But if the self is permanent, then it is not reasonable that it could be liberated, or what could be liberated if it is permanent. That doesn't accord with the way that things are. If the permanent self is in a suffering state, how could a permanent entity be affected by any kind of cause, be benefited or harmed by any sort of other cause? So if it is the case that the self is permanent, how could it be liberated? So it follows that it is unacceptable that it could be, because it is unsuitable to be a result. If something is permanent, there's no way that it can be benefited or harmed by any kind of a cause.
Oh, yeah. Oh, the end of the got to simply shout. Oh, Sanjay from the Kagala, my favorite condo. And it Tarba Tobiata, Nason Tunga Tariata, and it took them my Keba Mabuyora, Chulu Mabuyora. No, there's a Tamage Ta Takba Rawa Rangetuba, Taxi Rawaji Das, Ti tagara yoba shisha che, and ti member tapshi, ta koala kento taherata, or tendechane, ya lam top dread, tendinam shamambuyada. Tinia sangi chumde de pedusa, ti tado zimbati, nanga samsang anjidanga, samsang samlute, shishane, tele majene shane, tini tap shanda chana, tendo tarba yungumarco, negam, kentene ko shakshin churu yungura. Nambale yorwa kwa tunge rangshin dijadu komne kwa le shenja churu yorwa taine tendo pangbe sawa ne meba soyage tapshi te regi omarto o ti indizan ko ta meba komgu de se karso de tubda mabuchi yudisa kansa tarwa deba ta ngesung tungele tarwa deba ni kwa le tarwa deba kansa te zoge samlutan samabuchi yordo o tina le tinde sungutu tina tinde sung ta kare na samde o di mari dire shegu yora kakba chesu de shenda ke pajo de nena sam neba ke samluge shegu mara nga zu chena ne da shina ngo ne su de de shin do de de mi do se pajo ne ya chu se kare na su she a de mare ta yene ta me ne de mare ta ba da tembo ko de se chu se ngo be ne zu da tembe chu se de kare she ne te she gura ni pala she to she shana te do ne tarba tom dunga kansa to o til tinde su do tele tinde su do so so che ba che o ta ti me do san so so lo ya kare te ne tele jogu ya da o ti chane tande de tama de ta ye ba shisha chen ni chi she tele ma de spa ka so ta to tele so de kusen she ma bu yon de te yong ga da o ti chi kuna.
No. So here, we should keep in mind that prior to the Buddha, there were many different kinds of scholars thinking about the sort of nature of cyclic existence and thinking about liberation and so forth. And so there are many different traditions that occurred prior to the Buddha, that most of them, well, all of them, that asserted some kind of a self, whether it was a permanent, singular, autonomous self or a self-sufficient, substantially existent kind of a self. But they take that as a foundation, and then based upon that, the existence of such a self, they then describe kind of other methods by which one gets out of samsara. Then, for them, the existence of such a self is a foundational kind of a principle. And so, for them, then the sort of thoughts of I and mine accord with reality. Whereas when the Buddha came along, he principally espoused the idea of selflessness. And so the thoughts of I and mine are actually what is the problem, what is the root of our cycling within samsara. And so without extricating those kinds of thoughts, the Buddha explained that one is not able to attain a definite or a stable kind of liberation from samsara. You could say meditate on the faults of samsara and maybe attain a temporary sort of suppression of suffering, but you're not going to be able to be liberated from that without this understanding of selflessness. So it's not just sort of for the purpose of debating with others or being contentious that the Buddha is asserting this, but rather it's something that we need to think about because it is what accords with reality. So if there were such a self, one wouldn't be able to achieve liberation. And so by presenting this kind of reasoning that establishes that there is no such self, and these reasons that accord with reality, then this is in order to change their way of thinking, to elicit a new kind of understanding within their mind and be able to understand that if there is such a permanent self, there couldn't be, say, liberation from samsara.
Oh yeah, you tande tindua. Nema buba nare shudwa. Nema buba sina namba sanje barwa. Namba sanje bu tudama chitama na sanje tudama chira. No, tene kong tende sigwada. Ko chala nyeba mede se. Oh, tando kongdo, right? Chebe tene kende ngazule kende yugumare sigwardo. Ko chala nyeba mede. Kansa de se. Oh, tando ngazu kondo. Kansa takji rawa chengi ta du tuba yina. Ene digi mare se takji rawa chengi ta du meba kombate. Ko le tarji ki tab tamba re shera. O te induzan ta koge. Nema bu debaga chirubaga ta namba mai be keba mambuke ta takba yore ta rangya tuba rawadu tuba yego de timana ane kewanga mane dirion dine chimando yiringbu tarwa tuba chingetu te mare sheba telaya kukyusechi du samgyora te de ta keji jisene degmedo samgyora yinju nangbarwa ta inaya 다 딱바지 추저되는 남바가 셔네 다 딱바다 라와다 전제 주바시여나 네 딱바이네 고 유르도 동게 메시코데 그다 갱경한 걸 팬을 유라 메시코요데 대체네 지금도 딱바 인선에 지금도 삼다 바 인선에 지금도 삼제 다음에다 간도야 저도 메슬라 당가치는 갈이야 다 딱바다 미닥바티 인시체나 딱바 인신에 껴요 것도 미닥바 인신에 껴요 것도 당에 따메다 간도야 저도 매바 인실랍게 인시체라 못디스거라 된도 가서 내마 보가 나를 고잘라 예바 메데 간사데 따메다 간도야 저도 매바 되베 세로시나 소데 내마 보 대박 되바디 치구나 야
So here, then we have this opponent that is a Vatipudriya, and this opponent is actually within the Buddhist school. So within the Vaibhashika philosophical school, this is one of the divisions. And so here, they are sort of refuting both the self being expressed as permanent or impermanent. So they say we are not as at fault. So here again, we've just sort of refuted how could there be a permanent self? And they say, well, we are not at fault since we assert that the person is not expressed as either permanent or impermanent. So again, there were those sort of previous like Hindu scholars that said that there needs to be some kind of a permanent self such that one is able to have a self, the same self that is liberated or that was within samsara. And so they don't think that that is an acceptable kind of a position, but they also don't think that it is acceptable that the self be momentary, be impermanent in that sense of something that is disintegrating moment to moment. And so for them, they try to take this path of saying that, well, it's not acceptable that the self be impermanent in terms of being momentary, but it's also not acceptable that the self be permanent because of the sort of faults that come from that. So their way of approaching it is to say, well, we assert a person that is neither permanent nor impermanent.
Oh yeah. That the English Tangma Sawa de Ledwati. Tunge Meji Gungini Tari take a Tala take on Leserwa. Tangma de Kansak Dami Musum to talk with Shirapte, Sibal Le Tarje Rese. Te Yansi Yang Sibe Tunge Mejibe Kusengi Tap Damba Rese. Tagba ina Nicolia Dami Tobata Tadun Zimbabwe Pemba to never tend to Yunguma Res. Or Titangma to Sawa de Ledwa. Tunge Meji Gungini Tari is Tala take on Lese to Dorwa. What teacher? Yeah.
No. So then no. So again, looking at the sort of root verses for this, where we have said that the non the wisdom directly realizing no self is what affects liberation. And so here in the root text, in this numbering here, it's at 203. Liberation is the cause of the non-arising of suffering. How could a permanent entity be liberated? So here again, if anything that is a permanent entity, how could that be affected by any sort of a cause? As it can't be, how could we have liberation for a permanent entity?
Oh yeah, Tata de Nema Tibago, Kansa Tamida, Kandu and Choto Mes and get telepa Kakbasura or Leja Yordo. Kansa de Church, Debungaya, Juma in Bartas, and Karachana, Kansa de Debungaya, Juma in Bartas, Chandalia, Kidisane, Chandalia, Debupani, Duet, or Juma in Bata. Kansa dene chochen debun gaya gyuma imbarta. Mida nido choto mebesi, ki mida ba yinsi lagu mesi dwa. Mida ba mayina ni kolya debu ta gyuda tere namsha teg marwa singoro. Kansa dene chochen debun gaya gyuma imbarta. Mida ba nido choto mebesi. Yang kansa de chochen kyo le chingba da tarba chidabu yote mebata. Kyo koa le chingba tunge nyongba da. Yang koa le tane tunge nyong meguba gyurwa. Tende namsha miruwa tala sigore. Kyo le chingba da tarba chidabu na yobar gyute ma imbar tas. Tende mea tas gordo. Meba tal dugres, ren dugres goda. Ta meda kando a chudu mebe. Kyo takba sinsina digmare. Midaba insina chudu mese. Tende keling dwa sungoda. Chucha mebe sere. Takba imbar tal chindu gi shi kan shi jingmi imbe sere. Te taade kiran chene takba imbar tal sigora nema bote bala. Taade takba imbar tal. Ching koa re ching badan koa la trebe shi kan shi ra. Chindu nyongsa ki kansa imba kan shi ra. Jingmi imbe sere. Tele chindu yungu marwa kansa takba ina. Chindu gi shi kan shi jingmi imbe sere. Chindu gi shi imba kan shi jikba meba imbe sere. Takba imbar tal. Koa chindu gi shi ni re ni ko jikba mendo asa. Kebar taase rangi rangshin jikba mebe cho dela keba nam. Rangi rangshin dila gyura mebe che tambu kari ni taga rangi dete mato gyugi kol penyo draba gyugengi penyo draba menge. Kitu san gyugengi keba mayinge. Ane ko gyugengi wangi gyuton duju menge dila takba sigwa. Tende cho dila takba sigwa res. Kangi rangshin jikba mebe cho dila keba nam takba si chobe chiris. Di ese jikba lokbe rangshin chi takbar teba tene takba yena ngobe o tanda shungdegirwa kangi rangshin jingmeba tela kenam tachi choyose ta tangma de tsawa yungwarza di jikba la sokbe rangshin chi takbar teba tene ese di jikba lokbe rangshin jikba mengenge jikba le lokba jikba mahimbe choyosele yani takba sigwares jikba lokbe rangshin chik takbar tenbe ese takbar tene ese takba yina ngobe keba dansa takba yin ngobo yin sigra chita ma tuzu tangu niga yin sigra da tuda kongba chene takba ngobo yung marto tuni kasira kebar tene takba yina ngobe keba da shima drubali ya takba yin singe o tende lamge o tuzu pa kagi o re chira shima drubna chwe ma yina koli gyurdon dreke yung marto takba gyurmi ki chwe yung marto tirida, ta tiche ti sawa di nyamdo lapsane yabudwa. Mida nido cheme ka tenen gaya gyuma yinse, kira mida ba yinse laptuku mena, ene kansa di pene kareya gyudan ken che tuku ma resu wada. Cheche mingla jingdan tara chita bunda yuebar gyuse. Ene ta mida gaya yinse laptuku mebe ne kira, tele ya jingba dan tarba tozo chidari yuebar yinde teg ma resu. Jingdan ta chita bunda yuema yin. Ini takba senge de rangi rangshin le ya gyugin wangi gyudon dronge mendo na gyudon dronge mena hani tele ya takba segres kange rangshin jing meba tele kenam tachi chos o tishi kushanara.
So here then in response to this Vatiputria opponent, who again, this is a sub-school within the Vaibhashikas, so they are a Buddhist school. In response to this, their assertion that the self of persons is something that is inexpressible, is either permanent or impermanent. Gyaltsabje's response is, it follows that whatever person you assert is not the cause of any result because it has not been expressed as impermanent. So if you are saying that this is not expressible as impermanent, then that means that it cannot act as something that is impermanent, as in being subject to causes and conditions. Something that is not impermanent cannot affect results, cannot bring about results because it is not impermanent. And impermanent is that which allows us to say something is subject to causes and conditions. So the way that we're able to posit that there is an experience of suffering suffering and then a freedom from suffering is because this self is impermanent. So if it is not impermanent, then it cannot be the cause of any result. It also follows that it does not exist in such a way that it is bound or freed, because it is not expressible as either permanent or impermanent. So you can't say that such a self exists in such a way as it is bound or free, because it's not expressible as either permanent or impermanent. And so there's like there's no basis to then say that it is that it is subject to bondage or freedom. And so it then will follow that this self is permanent. It follows that it is permanent because it is the basis of bondage and freedom and is indestructible. So basically, they're saying that, well, according to this sort of logic, it would have to fall under being something that is permanent, because you are asserting that it is the basis of samsara and nirvana, the basis of bondage and freedom, and it is something that is indestructible. So we've already established that this is not impermanent, so it's not able to be subject to any kind of destruction. And if that is the case, then something that is not subject to destruction or not affected by any kind of causes, it follows that this reason pervades, because the wise call permanent that dharma whose own nature is indestructible. And so, having shown that that it is acceptable, but something lacking destructibility is permanent, this reasoning also well refutes the assertion that if something is permanent, it must necessarily be a functioning entity, and that a non-existent entity is permanent. So here, the Vaibhashika school again asserts that there can be permanent entities or permanent things, whereas the higher schools, the higher tenant schools, would say that that is not possible. And so here it's basically like the basis is not established. If you're saying that something cannot be impermanent, then it can't affect any kind of causes. We can't posit it as being bound and freed. And if you're trying to say that it's not permanent, well, it has to become permanent, because it's something that is indestructible. So here in the root verses, it says, whatever is not the cause of any result has not been expressed as impermanent. It also does not exist in such a way as to be bound or freed, since it is not expressible as permanent or impermanent. The wise call permanent that whose nature is indestructible.
Oh yeah. Tezura kangi rangshi jingme ba tela kenam tashi so tie chi lamne omoto. Takba singede ko kiri san korang ho to de kyujingi keba mayingerwa. Jigdu de kyujingi jigba jigso da ta meba sadu de kyujingi wangi meba de do tenda mayinge tele takba sigura chetelia. Jigdele ya ine ko takba de shi tu takdo yenge chele takba de shi do. O tende mare keba sene ko kaje ne mane keba yo mare takba ina tu taktu nebe ngeba yo mare pena pumba do si yebe ina pumba dungle yona pumba de tendo takbe cha mambu yora kyujinle keba mange takbe cha yoba sero pumbe nelu sero ra pumbe ta tongba ni sero tende yebe ina Dumache takbe cha yore nyamdo chi yungora takbe tasam gi chimambo takba yinge kyujin ma chinge nyamdo yora o tezu pumba meba cha sun tezu meba cha gra ranga ware takba le ranga wa yeshe da kabri meba cha yeba de meba cha yor ta tunda jikpa shi yo mar tele tu ta tu yo ko chi yo mare kora kaje yena rashi jikpa meba che shi ne takba shi yo to o tezu tuna
So here again, as it says here, the wise call permanent that whose nature is indestructible. So if something is subject to various causes and conditions, is able to affect a result, then that is expressed as impermanent. But there are, I suppose, there are those things that the wise call permanent, in that their nature is indestructible. And these, we have a sense like generally that something permanent means that it is always there. However, we can have things that are occasional permanence, as as in, for example, if you have something like a pot or a vase, the sort of there are elements or parts of that vase that are actually permanent, as in, those things that we designate, like the vase's existence, the vase's mode of abiding, that vase's emptiness. Those things are permanent, as in they are not subject to destruction in the way that the pot is. But they only last so long as that basis, that pot lasts. So we can only talk about the emptiness of that pot for as long as the pot exists. But when that pot is gone, we wouldn't say that the emptiness of the pot was destroyed. So again, these are sorts of things that are not subject to destruction in the way that impermanent things are, but they don't have the sense of permanence as in lasting, existing forever, but the sense of not being subject to, or whose nature is indestructible.
Oh yeah. That never buba suggest that never buba labetele pa shabachiyo. Never buba suggest munge Ponsum Kelembe Mosa Tawan de Ponla, Kansatine Tagbar Murte, Marigbar Talsa. Takira to the Munge Kelangitose, Tagba, my Medaba, my Chui, Tagba, my Medaba, Yislaptuk Mena, Tamida Kaya, my be, Chushi Kelling Yore, Tamida Kaya. Munge Ponsum Munges and get the Chitang, Gawata Munges in Yora. Gawas in the Kawa Bumba in Gawarava, Kawa Bumba Gawarava. In a Munges in Martilia. Munges in a Tagbata Midabas and then get it. Yana Tagba Yangure, Yana Midaba Yangure, Church in Sinjetela, Yana Tagba Yangure, Yana Midaba Yangure. Tell a Munges or right, Tini Karuchi Madon Rosamangatel, Tagbata Midaba Sarah, Dujet and Dumacha Sarah, Pumbata Pumba Mahimba Sarah. Oh, tell a young Munges you are. Ni ga yin ge me ba ni ga ma yin ge me ba tin ka ru ji che na tin ka ru chi na le ba do ko ba tele nge ge su do ta ba da me da ba ji de nge ge ra o ti de ne ma bo ba che je nge ge la se ko nge ge ge che de le ki na pung bu sum ba ke le do se nge ge yin ni ga yin ba ji yong ma ra che ta ba ma yin me da ba ma yin si la ku me na pung ba de ta ba ma yin me da ba ma yin ta me da ka ya ma yin be che de re do ya do Pumbusumbachi, Tagbata Meda Kama, Punsumbe Church, Kelling, your Estandalia. Oh, Tisonza, Mugela, Pumbusumba Kelembe, Mosetawa de Ponlas, take care of Otsaro Dese, Tagba, my Medaba, my Kijiba, my Mijibe Chema, Church Kelanani, Kebanam Kasure, Mosaki Shiris order. Moche tawa de pon la kansa de ne takwa me she tele keran kansa takwa se pa chi tha chen lap shan ka gre so wara ma rik ba ta te ne jigba me ben go bo yin be se ke jigba ye se lap tu mo do ta jigba me ben go bo yin na ne takwa se lam ne ya gre se de ya na o ye ti ba do sa che sa ro ta de ne ya na de ya je number ha ma ni so number che ben go be number Mebala Charos, Tadi Dura, Tada Dingazo, going and Gopa, Sixeswa, Tenitendo Ama in the Gula Kesos, Alle Digicuna, Mandas, Yagonda.
Yeah. So here, then turning to the next part of the root text, where it says, "Thus you should abandon this shameful view and call that person permanent." So here, it follows then, thus that the Vatsiputriya should abandon this shameful view that accepts a third possibility where only mutually exclusive direct opposition is possible. So here, this gets into the importance of understanding that the two categories of permanent and impermanent are things that are direct opposites. So we could sort of have, and I don't know if this works as well in English, like opposites or contradictory things like a vase and a pot. Those are not the same thing. They're sort of contradictory, but it's not like everything has to fit into those two categories of vase and pot. There are many things that are not. But when you have a kind of mutually exclusive situation like permanent and impermanent, these direct oppositions, wherein there's no acceptable third category. Everything is either permanent or impermanent. You could even have this like with respect to a vase. Everything is either vase or non-vase. Those are mutually exclusive opposite categories. And so here, when it comes to this kind of view where the Vatiputriyas are trying to say, well, we assert a self that is expressible as neither impermanent or permanent, you have to respond with, well, this is a kind of a shameful view because all things, all objects must fall into being either permanent or impermanent. There's no third category of something that is neither permanent nor impermanent. And so, as they seem, they accept the idea of mutually exclusive, direct opposites. But if you follow the proper kind of reasoning, it would mean that they need to call this person permanent, and it is reasonable that they so call it because their reasoning it isn't there because by their reasoning it is an indestructible entity. So basically if you follow the reasoning, it arrives at the idea of indestructibility, which means that you need to assert it as being permanent. This kind of shameful view wherein you don't understand properly the kind of mutual exclusion entailed by direct opposition is something that should be abandoned.
Oh yeah. The tenengo se tawa de pon la tene takbar me se sidwa ti yenje de sungora sawa de sungora yana te yenje number lama ni su den ko den ge number rwa gokba che ne shiwa da kya number ni din ba ko den ge number ni shiwa da kya number ni dira shiwa de tanda te tungye she lan ge me be sing ge ti tengyu ba kya number de tungye ke kyuni ni chang ching yin se tene tengyu ra dende soso mache beche rwa shiwa da gyanu be namba ni tembe za soso mache na digurese ta ine tene tendo ama inde singe shiba gokbe namba tangbu tenge sing gokten tuwes gokbe namba tembe ya tuwese ne ma tembe shunglu cha na digurese shiwa da gyanu ba namba tembe soso loga losu shane digure losu macha ne gokbe namba shebe tuwege shunglu cha na digurese ngara o techi chushana yana te yenje number hamani soso mache bar gokbe number tuwe bashidu cha ros o techi ani gokden sobra ta lamde shegara hone
So here then it says, alternatively, that discussion of the truth of cessation can be applied to only covering the aspect of cessation without being divided individually into the two remaining aspects. So we had here a discussion that included dividing into the aspect of peace and the aspect of sublimity, beginning with that last section of bondage is the cause of the arising of suffering and so forth. And so here one can do this kind of presentation or discussion of the truth of cessation by dividing into all three of those, having a separate sort of discussion of the truth or the aspect of peace and the aspect of sublimity. Or alternatively, you could explain this as just covering the aspect of cessation without being divided individually into those two remaining aspects. And so this concludes then the truth of cessation, and we will turn to the truth of the path.
Oh, tatanda de mashi bahata kugra pech tenshi meta so chudu se batanda ngaju she de temba shishe ani te tenge samlata komja namba ne chudu shishi samlata ngora temba shishe te tenge keju sine medo namba samlata komja telia ani chudu she ngora o te keju she ngora te namba shishi ba mita ba tunge tembalia mita tunge wa tonga ta me shera ene de kasra tunge do kunju tembadala ku tunge yu ku tunge kunju wa ku kunju tunge rabdu ke wa rabki tunge ki ke se shishe yora en gogba dele en gogba shiwa kanum ninjo se shishe yora lam dele ta lambo ne gura tarba tuba suba lam se rigbe namba se lamriba tube nabas ninjing nabas shiche tetandalia samrutaya komjatelia tene shishi chudu sheba hotina netanda gobe namba shidi shebe ke shora kano be namba de hole lamden shetu ninjin se tal dimosh hotiba de chiksuna.
So here, then we have, beginning with the discussion of the four noble truths, we got into the various, the 16 aspects of the four noble truths, which are like points of sort of contemplation with respect to each of the four noble truths. So when it comes to the truth of suffering, we had the aspect of impermanence and suffering and selflessness and emptiness. And then when it came to the truth of the origin of suffering, looking at that as being sort of the cause, the cause of the sort of source of all, this strong arising and the aspect of condition. Sorry, those translations may be slightly different. And so then we have here at the truth of cessation, the aspect of cessation, the aspect of peace, the aspect of sublimity, and this aspect of definite emergence that is actually explained within the truth of the path. And then here, with regard to the truth of the path that is coming, we have the idea of it being a path, it being awareness or knowledge, being liberation, and providing definite removal. And so those are the aspects that are to come, the kind of points of contemplation for these each of these truths.
Oh, that ko kwa jube kyuandu chene tungeten bada kunjuten baniche tetengene komja samlutan erwa kwa dogbe kyudi lamden da gogwasche kwa juto jirimba chasanchi ngobo tokshu jirigbe tuguyara ngobo korangi nedan kachane ya ngusumla tudu bado ya yana ngusum jitube tende shison ani atuguyara teko ngobo korangi nechu Tunge Dembarashi, Kunju in the Kansa, so Bele, Sange, Kansa, Samlutanda, Kandendo, Tiletene, Tunge, Kandasin Yongudo, Ti Ribaltene Tuguara. And then Goba, Tunge, Jigsawa, the Nguyen Sade, Sawa de Meba Songede, Sawa de Nasam and Jishuk Shabade, Ta Meba, Tokbatege, and then Tami the Weshira, Tiletene Tadurese. We were two sugar Ribaltene, Tembashi, number 2, Comja Chudu, the Tuguara, or Tandandi.
So here then, the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin of suffering describe the stages by which we engage in samsara and cycle in samsara, and the truth of cessation and the truth of the path describe those stages of getting out of samsara. And so the various aspects of these four noble truths and the description of the process by which we engage in samsara and extricate ourselves from samsara, these causes and results are something that we establish through sort of the reasoning based on reality, or sort of these actually ultimately come back to our own direct perceptions. So we are able to establish, for example, that the grasping at itself is the cause of our sufferings by investigating and using the power of reasonings that accord with reality in order to actually establish for ourselves that is the source of our suffering, and that is something that can be removed. So here we are looking at, and again, these are all sort of things that are established by perceptual authority. Ultimately, they lead back to that, and we use our reasoning in order to come to the proper sort of conclusions, reasoning that accords with reality. So here we are getting to how we can establish that that based upon the wisdom realizing selflessness, we are able to remove that cause of samsara and attain freedom.
Oh yeah, that Shiba Lamdi Dembala Nista Lamdi Shego, Tarba Tobiak, Lamgang Winete, Tene Koya Zawa Tangziri, T. Shingi Meba Toba Tamingus to Toba Lamde, that coil to a Lamgonet in Dires, Tishego, Shiba Lamdi Dembala Nese, Tami Toba Shirap, Sibala to a Lamdo Trubas. Oh, Tombasanji some den de Pebango, Kebanam Yeshe. Taxi Rawachen Gita, some Ranget to be say Gita, you some Samlute, the Ran, Shane, Any ya lam com the nigger call a cantor of Tashi Tendation, a connego never knew what the soldier the order. Or did you know Yanko Zawane says, Lam de Timaris, Zawane Pam Tugumares, Zawane Ponzi Lam de Damit of Lam de Rest is to be order. Shiba Lam de la Nice, Damit of Shirap, Siba letter Lam du Truvas. Tangzi Sibe Tower Trubasta, Nambachana, or Sanjay Sumbanashi Chana, Tangzi de Koetsawa de Orno, Rama without Zimbabwe. Rangya to without Zimbabwe. Now, something Anjunam do the Yabuda Johnson and Anju Shuk Sambuade, Toburaji Johnson and Anju Shuk Sambuade, Tarte in Angaziko Pamada Chihuahua. Tiwanga Koyunga, so take Koetsa, the rest to Gare. At the Ducasa. Tami dobe shirab sibale truve lam du trubase. Tangzin di sibe sawa trubase. Ta tambu dami dobe shirab sibale truve lam reese. Ti trubadele ni trulam ngue songa tas. Sibale truve jige siba koale tendu truve jige lam de ene ka reese. Nangba chene tami dobe shiraba. Atele awa di ma reese shenda sutsoba pangase. Tene ta tambu Trulam ngue songa dira. Tami dogbe koale truchigi koale tendu tarchigi lamdi karerese koe zawa nyimu tendu sejigi lamdi karerese di ngue songi wardo di ngari shesin bese di ngari shesin be kondo ya mida dungi tong tami shi shesara dungi dimbe namba shebe kasu ngari shesin be tami ngue sumdu togbe lamdi chuchingese sibe le truwe lam yindese 다 코알에 ngone 트고 yana 텐데 트지게 람강고네 데레세 코 코르지게 람강고네 데 라와 다도 심바테레세 다티 메바 콤나 닝무숨도 도바데 코알에 트지게 탑고네 데레세 자와네 트지게 탑지레스 거라 시발에 트에 람인데 당진 징원이 도쿄 콤베 네바 타다세 세네 nenju tarsin batobeses 다돈 짐바데 세월 라오에 다돈 짐바데 라니 라오에 다돈 짐바데 다돈 짐바데 코에 주레 자외 주데 테레 땡외에도 땡외기니 뭐 무슨 내치들이야 뇌기는 원 진당 계획 거네 퍼져도 예바 선거래 아니 다음에 또 봐도 뛰어 말이 디마레시 멤버도 선거도 진당 원게스라텔이야 당진기 ngani 도세 randan jindang ngo son kewe taadun zimbage ngo ki nyebola ke kombale se tame dobe lo de kombale nyeba tada sene nenjur tarshimba tobe se o tini tangji di ba se du chakba 다다 다기 wala chakba tele tene dada dagi wala nebe rigya kondu ke chakdangi shawando sonde le sakba kurande chodu gordon se gime chagi ore tindu ngadu 당진기 상황도 주네 착 당진기 꺼내는데 착당기 상황도 주대요노 어디 내가 디펜 주르소래 nenjur topsigara ngarji nekab de pen jurachine ta 다그 착나다 당진라 소바 또 매베 nekab jun돌와 어디 텐데 주르지 글람데 담에 도베 담에 무슨 도로 양양 겁나 제 톱톱 그래 숨겨라 당진기 원이도 그 공발에 네바 차소 때네 네바 차소 세네 nenju와 타신바 토베스 어디르도 다디야 그래서래 셰신 남데 공발에 nenju를 생겼대 자와 어디시구나
So here, then we turn to the truth of the path. And so this is divided into proving that the wisdom realizing no self is the path to freedom from samsaric existence, and proving that self-grasping is the root of craving. So this proving that the wisdom realizing no self is the path to freedom from samsaric existence, it has its own divisions. But here, so first, we need to establish that the wisdom realizing selflessness is what is able to get us out of samsara. Again, prior to the Buddha, there were those that asserted some kind of a permanent, a singular, autonomous sort of a self. And for them, they may be able to sort of temporarily suppress the causes of their suffering, but they're unable to fully remove that suffering because they don't get rid of the fundamental cause. So the Buddha has taught that it is this holding to an I, holding to the mind, that then is the cause of all of our suffering, all of our creation, or generating the afflictions and accumulating karma and so forth. So it is, we have this sort of sense. It's not all the time, like when we're just sort of going and living our daily life, but when something bad happens in particular, there's this really strong sense of I that arises, and this is the kind of grasping at a self that is identified as the cause of suffering. So here it is by as it says, and so here we have the again the proving that the wisdom realizing no self is the path to freedom from samsaric existence. And this is first divided into identifying the path to freedom and then disposing of objections to that, getting at the kind of objections raised by those non-Buddhists that say, well, oh no, that's not the root of samsara. So it says then the path already explained before, which is the direct realization of no self. So the path explained before, including those kinds of meditations on the truth of suffering and the aspect of impermanence, suffering, no self, and emptiness. So the path. Then having developed that, which is this direct realization of no self, is the path to freedom from samsaric existence, because through accustoming it as the direct antidote to self-grasping, one eliminates all fault and attains a completely transformed state. So here we can establish, we can see that the clinging to some kind of an autonomous or independent sort of a self is is the root of samsara. And so this kind of grasping at such a self is directly opposed by the wisdom realizing selflessness. These two, their modes of grasping are in direct opposition. So grasping at such a self is completely undermined by the wisdom realizing there is no such self. And thus that acts as a direct antidote. And by that acting as a direct antidote to self-grasping, one eliminates then all faults in that one will no longer give rise to attachment towards those things that are of mine and so forth, and no longer give rise to anger toward the other and so forth, that leads us to then, due to those afflictions, due to our attachment and hatred and so forth, we accumulate karmas that then perpetuate this cycle of samsara. So here, by accustoming it, this wisdom realizing no self as the direct antidote to that self-grasping, undermining the root of samsara, one attains a completely transformed state wherein such a self-grasping is no longer able to arise at all. So the root verse then reads, the path already explained is the path, since through accustoming it, one attains a transformed state.
Oh yeah. Taniba dura akasha. Tele cheba pansedra. Tami tobe sirapti siba koale tandu tresiga lamre structura. Tatelia or de shanda tobaku or de tresiga lamunete rigma reseche sebakudo. Bangbalar dobe sebas or keraniga Yamu dobe ina yangyaki grese. Timan dodo mirror archie keba kajisana. Kansa dancing that Chagdan the said the Kondoya Konayo Mares, Timando Mirum Chabasugara, and Telenjavora. Yachusa Doja, some son of Tos Ranga Mav Chagri, Ayanga Ungudes, got 10 in Dogba, the shot 10 and Dogba, Condo 10 and Dogba, Tendeo Mares, Sigma Resi, Tenditsabasugua. Tatambo Pangbalar Dogba Chabatera, Chabat Teleyan Kashendua. Pangba Tarjin Domisis Arupa, Pangba Tarchin Sasuna, and then Dosi Mare. Te Kares Pangba Chip Pangba Tarchin Pang Sasuna, Te Pangan de Ten Dog Beshiduya, Tabishi Chigmare, tin dogbe tam misibas yangja yongye tab yomare dame dogbe shira tangzin ji nyembur mitebas tatil tunzen kashin duga to no panje yungura ta tangbudra ngado oh pangba tarji do misiba sedira chipang char sona nen yor ngar chagdang ge shawa do jo tangzin ge shawa do jo le sabe kabi negab tele pan yur cha sona lam gombal tene tele mate be negab shenda jili gursona sugyordo ne jurbe semla nyeba jebe neba me bas ngar ge chagdang ge shawa do jo tangzin ge shawa do jo negab tele dene tanda tangzin ge shawa do majur chagdang ge shawa do majur atende chi cha sona tame gombal tene tende gursona ne jurbe sem delia ta yanga nyeba chaso jebe neba yo mare sungora ye jang yun de mene ba a Geshe keba di yebe na ko yun ring bune to ye yo ma res ya ta de subject to lang dira ta tambo ne jurwe sembla nyeba kebe nyeba me ba to ya yan dor ne Geshe to du sum do tina ne tan dor ne de ma lo shana kede ne jur kede rishi nyeba yeme to ne jur jans o kede kapse renga de kondonga gela so wa chana so me ba jura yina yasa lam ngar me sa do jwa shindos tami dogbe lam de kera mita ba dogbe lam do ngar mene sa do gi sig do as kasa julia o tina shi ko ne ga renga yomo me ba cha yine me ba yine yangja ke yungur ba sigora kede rishi nyeba yeme do ne jurja lam ngar me ba sa do jwa shindo kyan chakso ja lar jongo shena ase o kajik debate bado chikona ya odistuna subject
So
of it
here, yeah, there
is
are a lot of different sort of subheadings here, so I'll try to go through them relatively quickly. But we get second to then disposing to objections. So saying that this wisdom, the direct realization of selflessness, is not able to attain or not able to elicit a kind of definite, stable sort of freedom. Some people object, thinking that that you can't attain such a definite kind of removal. So this then we dispose of the objection that abandonments are reversible, that they could be reversed, disposing of the objection that stains are unsuitable to be removed, and so forth, and disposing of the objection that even if they can be removed a little bit, it is impossible that they be thoroughly removed. So there are those that think that there's no way that one could attain an abandonment that is irreversible, that there's going to be another arising of that self-grasping. And there are those that say, well, it's not possible to remove those stains at all. They're kind of like permanent. And some think that, well, maybe even if they could be taken away a little bit, we can't completely eliminate those kinds of stains or defilements. So first of these is that disposing of the objection that these abandonments are reversible, that somehow, even if you've abandoned something completely, it could arise again. And so this, the first topic of this is the impossibility of a complete abandonment being reversed. So this then begins with the impossibility of generating fault in a mind in a transformed state. So someone might think, well, just that even if you have attained a kind of state wherein you have eliminated that grasping at a self, maybe that could come back again. And so this is the idea that is going to be refuted. So when you have attained a state where you are no longer under the control of self-grasping, no longer under the control of one's afflictions, that is a state that is irreversible. Those kinds of afflictions can't arise again. And this we'll get into this. And then someone might have the kind of objection that even if there is, sorry, from our side, that even if there is a fault, it's impossible that it remain for a long time in this kind of mind that is in a transformed state. And so we'll begin with the brief demonstration.
oh yeah oh do better quality oh yeah this one what that de ka sore Kete rishi nipa yeme de gyugya all tradition. Ta dinin goglam ni jun da ni jin do mite be cheba. Ta tonda ko kare chogo resena. Gado dagi gogden shedun gogba shiwa kanum ni jun ski sherwa. Sarji pancha sona neba do neba rese. Neba suje neba shedele ni kujuara. Tejon meba da minjurwa nigal kondora. Nge sare rese na. Nebar to sena. O tiende ko tene pangbares yangja ke yo mare lar me jun su ji pangbares ninjung ki namba shek do gogba shedu lamde shedu za ninjin se tame ngusum do to be lamde komge na chagdan la so be ngemo nebar do sebar chi ten do sebar chi res ninjin ki namba shegora o tonda tame to be shireb de ngemo ten do seba chawane sene larki ki mebe sugi pangbe shete nebar jinjin shete teg mare gogden top sona lar me dog be sugi nyamolar dogju meba tandu pangba de teg mare stel sugi ore sigora tanda tama chobat ote chituna.
So here then, in this brief demonstration, the sort of point that is being debated here. Again, we have this idea that, according to the Buddhists, that the truth of cessation and the truth of the path have these aspects of definite emergence and definite removal. So we can talk about this definite as in being like completely removed without any sort of doubt, without any kind of remainder. And so here, the sort of state, or sorry, the element of definite emergence in terms of the truth of cessation is establishing that there is that complete abandonment. And this definite removal means that there's no longer the capacity to newly generate those kinds of afflictions that one has now completely removed. So this is the sort of basis of debate here.
Oh, the chawa de ta del doa. Kete ne jurga se ngar chagdan gi shawa do ju tang zin gi shawa do ju batele negam jur ne te me shawa yena ya yangya ke gi hore pena meta donge tok be lam dingar me chele start ki ju sigro akira hotina she nyomo negam me shane yangya ke ngure se chawa de doa. Kete ne jurga lam she kene jung she na se chaso nyomo be kene yangya yungure she na se dera chawa de oh dichilana.
So the root verse for this is saying, if you say, even if one transforms one state, just as a path originates, so flaws will originate again. So here, someone might think, well, just in the same way that you originate or you developed these paths, like understanding the various components of the truth of suffering and permanence and so forth, so too then should these mental states of grasping at a self arise again. So just like those paths originate, flaws will originate again. This is the sort of objection.
Oh yeah, Tami Kumbala Tene, Nargi Chagdangi Shamadu Jurbe Negap Tile Yonsu Jurwa, Nenju Tarchimba Tobe and Semdele Sujase, Kansak Semdisura. Killer Nebalar Joma de Yanga, Yamu Pansa de Yanga, Kondunga Jeta Dol Soba Yanga Yungmaresha. Karesna, Tami Tobe Shirab de Kula Neba Kebe Neba, Yeme de Chasim Bishes. Tami Bagong Gong Nusum de Tone. Kene taadun zimba dan ngayi se chakba dan tangwa di kiju me so sare se wada dami tobe shira ki kyola nyeba kebe nyeba yeme to tsawa no meba chesin beches ti tsawa di kares na mayi nyeba me se ro se dira yangya kewa mayi de dami tobe shira ki yangya kiju meba nyeba di meba so sare se oya.
So then again, this opponent thinks even if for a short time one transforms one state so that faults are non existent, still, just as an unprecedented path originates newly, so attachment and other flaws will originate again. So someone may think that just in the way that when you have an unprecedented path newly originating, this wisdom realizing selflessness, you can maybe transform your mind for a temporary sort of period, but you can't make it such that attachment and other flaws won't originate again. They will come up just the way those paths were generated in one's mind. So it continues saying, well, the this is the objection that it is unacceptable that the truths of cessation and path have, respectively, the aspects of definite emergence and definite removal. A mind that is in a completely transformed state will not have faults originate again in it, because in it, the wisdom realizing no self renders the capacity for generating faults non-existent. So there is no way to newly generate those kinds of faults again, because this wisdom realizing no self has rendered that impossible for it to arise again. So it says in the root verse, not so, because the capacity for generating faults is non-existent in such a state.
Oh, yeah, Tanyba Geshe, Lani Sudwa, Nanjur Tobe, Semdelia, Nebalara, Kigris, the Kigmaris, the Gesherwa, or De Caresana, Sunji Wangbu, Tati order, Semgi Ranshin, Namda to Tembas, Semgi Ranshin, Koran number Daba Tembasarwa, Ni Semgi Ranshin, Namda to Tembanese. Niba Geshe, Lani, Semgi Ranshin, Namda to Tembane, Zawas. Madimose. Ta sembi ranshin di number da pada station ba. Tangji wangbu number seba suje mara sungji wangbu number. Tandi dode ba da o teju danda lu delia namje kapsura. Ane ngusum teju kangalias tumju sigra. Sungji mesi tanji ngesi tanji nasila soba ngusum dua. O teju yu telia ngebe wangu jubares. Ngebe korang chu number teche. Ane ti thong de yo de sigura. Sungji mishi de su thong ina kora kari na ti thong de yo do. Jibare jine ko ji che tenge de thong de yo nga ju jibale nge she ten to yo mara. Pene sheng do de jine ko pene sakbar ji ku yo re kyap sun de thong to da thong to ba de thong to yo re kar so re. Nebe de to yo ra. Ta pene ya chi shenda tawe ne ju do ko nang de yo de so thong to yo mara ka se nge she ten to yo mara. 그래서 저도 tumju 인식이라 당무숨 맞춰와서거라 무숨도 나왔다도 맞춰와서 뭐 코란 그초 남바데네 코란 강에 뭐도 출낭되게 와래서 뒤통게 와래서 장무숨도 맞춰와래서 유기내주 소중함보다 전에 송지 미시대는 본바르지 가도다 입당 가리나 공원에도 통되게 와래 출남바데네 잘했다가 나시래서 거라 너 어때 제가 당고 숨고 장시디 게메바 마트와디 셰도 하던다 송지 왕부 넘버 셰바 셰제 수데 네 수데 네루라 코란 치다라 예바 데다르 좀베 장시체레 시고라 간데 주요나 티나시나 나와다도 텐징게 와레스 유데 네루 치다라 예바다도 좀바데 체게 셰섬 베체 yu sugi nelu la kande yewena teda zimbade Quran sur nambate banashi ane zingi war kashe to togyo kashe to togyo mare ina na nagi wade na nashi ko to togyo mare sungji mishi do le meda banang se ko delia ko duro che de bede nang de war churo sine konro de tong to bede ko tong de war Sanaway Matue Shibasora. Umatenju at the Luin, Mishit Kanga Tude or now Ramana Tubana Tushi Shara, Tanda Namde Lulia, Matue Shibare, Musum Tozo. Karis no webe wangi now chimbedes. Web Korangi Kai with the two number take or a tinzingura. Tanawa Nashikanga She to the Matu Siriora. Georgia but they could not they were the thought to go man, nation to go mad. Or Momboresha, Seboresha, somebody Sundu, Karina, they thought to grow. Oh, this were. So they Nelu Chidar about the Tatun Zimba Ranshin in the Nelu Chidar about Tatun Zimba, they trade some Ranshin basis. Koran Nelu Karavan Zimba, the Koran Casual. Tene, Teshindo, Te Ranginelula, Yuba, Tani, Tenchidar Yuba, Zimbello, de Kebers order. Teshindo, Sudi Sigora, Teshindo, Te Ranginelula, Chidar Yuba, Tani, Kitan de Chidar Yuba, Zimbello, de Keberseba in the Sudi. Coronezo Carina to number 10, something Mishi the Keber Sigre, Tade Candinati to number 10 transition the Keber Sigres. Keber Jeba Su de Ranshi de Nobu Suda to Charles of Kurazu Ranshi to Rango Ombol so number 10 the Zimbe Shebati mature the Keber Sigres. Su tende Ranshin in Bishiris, Su Kora tende Ranshin in Bade, Ranshin Chankan in Bade Su number 10 Goresa. What did you do now?
So here, then the more extensive explanation is divided into a few different parts. And first of these is showing that the nature of mind is pure, demonstrating the natural purity of mind. And so here, this then comes in the root verse 206. So to go down to the commentary to it, the sensory cognition that apprehends form has a nature such that it apprehends the actuality of that form just as the object exists. And so, and because apprehending the object, the actuality of an object just as it exists, is the dharma or nature of cognition. So here, according to the system that is presented here in Dharmakirti, direct perception then is unmistaken. So our various perceptions, our visual consciousness, auditory consciousness, olfactory, our taste, and so forth, our gustatory and tactile consciousnesses, all of these perceive objects just as they are. They are unmistaken are unmistaken with respect to those objects. So, for example, we are not able to necessarily realize all of the sort of subtle aspects of an object. They would say that the things like say if we have an object that's appearing, the sort of impermanence of that also appears to us, but that's slightly more hidden. We're not able to directly get at that necessarily, although it is appearing. But for the most part, our various types of consciousnesses see objects as they are. They are not mistaken with respect to those. So, if we're perceiving something like a fruit, we just see it as it exists, although we may not be able to get at like the subtle impermanence of that fruit as it's appearing to us. We're still able to access the object as it is in a kind of unmistaken way. So an object like form for our visual consciousness, we are able to realize that form as it is with direct perception. Although things like the impermanence of that form and so forth are appearing, those are more inaccessible to our direct perception. We don't necessarily, we're not able to elicit a kind of certainty with regard to those aspects based upon just their appearance. Now, this again is a presenting from a different philosophical school, whereas the Prasangikas, for example, would say that actually all of our, even our direct perceptions are mistaken because they are mistaken with regard to this appearing object. The object appears as though it were existent somehow from its own side. And so we are mistaken with respect to that. So again, we, according to this system, although we are able to, with our various consciousnesses, perceive objects as they are, we can't necessarily perceive their changing nature or something like that. There's no sort of, our direct perceptions can't get out those kinds of aspects, but they're able to sort of see the nature of a form, like a form or a sound project itself, and we're able to access that with our direct perception as it is. And this is the nature of cognition. And so, here then, continuing in the commentary, similarly, form also has a nature such that it is the generator of this cognition that apprehends just as it exists the nature of that object that has the self nature of existing in actuality, because the nature possessed by form is like that. Now, that's maybe a little bit difficult to understand, but the nature of a form is such that it projects, we're able to access that basic form in an unmistaken way with direct perception according to this system.
Oh, yeah, that's how they run the Sembir Namshi Yunjin Pai Church. Wong Bing Musum Samato, you so that the Rexala Soban Zimba, the Chisuado, Namshi Yunjin Pai Shu, Chidari Yudin Zimbada, Suda to Rexala Soba, Never Koran Nature, Chidari Yabanashi, two number degi or es. Wangi Juskra, Musum to Nobe Wangi Nabateba on the Pa, Zingares, Chidari Yabanashi, Nabatebanashi, Zingi or es. Chidari Yudin Zimbadas. Yaba Yeni, oh, Namshi Yunjiba, Chidari Yudin Zimbata. Yaba Yeni Tani de Kebasia, Koranetula, Suda to Rechala Soba, Koranetula, Kaimbate, Yaba Chidari Yaba Tenashi, so number 10, and Musum de Gatin Zingiores, or Atenashi Zingiores, or Sudin Zingiores. Yaba Yeni Tani de Kebasheba, so Koran Kebache, Ombote Sheba to get in Ashipan Zingres. Rashin de in Dilene, oh, Diba de Chikusana, yeah, Sawat.
No. So, looking then at the root verses, it says, cognition apprehends an object just as it exists. Apprehending an object is the dharma of cognition, and form is also the generator of that cognition that has an object that that has as an object that has the self nature of actually existing. So again, when it comes to the objects of direct perception, forms, sounds, smells, taste, touch, they appear as they actually exist. That is their kind of nature, and cognition apprehends those objects as they exist. That's the nature of cognition. So this is sort of the nature of form, that it is able to be apprehended by our visual consciousness, and they appear, and how they appear is how they exist. This is their nature, and that is how they are apprehended by our direct perceptions. Again, this is from a different tenant school's perspective.
Oh, yeah, Tandi Namdik Ludilia, Musum Tezulia, Mobe Wangi Nachi Basura, Wangi Juwas. Talk about Tezu, Mobe Wangi, soon number take your mother. The may say a connect to Bas, social Samluta, and take on any Nematon Deba, Tebata Sava Karina, Tunji Wangisura, now at Korangasune. Now I see a Tunjisura, Tunjitia, Nacho, and Tiwanga Koyu, Sensing Dura. Musum didn't over Koran so now. Talk about so movie on the now Mare. Talk about movie on the now and talk about Mambo talk to it. Till Mara Koran, get a share title, she loves on all titles, some Tunjikone, the man is 7 connection, Shanda Pasha, or did this cheaper. Now you were Sinjusera, talk about the Sinjus. Musum to the Tunjus, movie on the Jugas. Talk about the Letaman 7 connection was, or till Lapsena, yeah.
So here, then, according to the system of the Pramanavarttika, our direct perceptions access objects as they are. Those objects that appear to our sense perceptions appear as they are, and they are apprehended as they exist. So that is distinct. Then those objects appear in a way that they are like established. Their appearance is something that is established for us. Now, when it comes to conceptual kind of thinking, we don't have the object appearing directly, but rather we are using what are called mental images or generic images. And we are able to come to understanding through that process of conceptual thinking, from investigating and using reasonings. But that type of conceptual thinking involves what we sort of call as illuminative. We're not in the way that our direct perception and object appears, and we sort of access that appearance of that object in a direct way, the process of conceptual thinking and coming to certainty and understanding involves a process of sort of elimination. It's more of a kind of eliminative process to come to understanding, whereas the direct perceptions that we have are established sort of things. We see this object and perceive the object as it is.
Oh yeah, tanga judera. Niba se do ade tanga na. Niba geshe delia. Ira yege. Semge oh de tande. Niba geshe shi le ni do semge ran shin namda do temba se tande dera. Ta niba dera. Tima luburu atemba se niba dera do. Tima luburu atemba se. Oh niba geshe de le ni na ne. Namshi de ta de do sarse. Ta da niba de. Tima luburu atemba ne se do. You nelu midabada dameba so yelas. You korang nelu ngone de suda de resal so karena. Dije cheto nelu te kare. Netene ka sura niba. Timaluburu atemba ne se subject. You nelu midabada ase. Ta da busne ta midabada ro. Ne midabada ta meba so. Midabada ta meba rawe ta to meba de. Meba so yelas. Tishin the Pumbu Misawa Soba. Oh, tender days, Midas Chudu, you can nail tender days. Yella. Take not Nello Matua, Tona Bame to Tovar Gurusina, or that the Tobache doa. Dagasum to the Kanga Tonde your race Lavadova. Ralu Sheswa. Musum to the Yugi Wanga number Tever, Koran Kayim, but the Tonde your. You do the mination, you do the says, you but the time, my imbaji, captain the check, your Marakoran, but to Tonde Yora. Oh, Tishoda. Niba, today in Nasagora, and I can so that the Rejala Sobangusum, Machine Nashi to Tonash in Nasa. Niba Timalubra Tambane, Yuginelu, Midabada, Dames or Yilas, Yuginelu Monella, Midabare Dora, Kaji Jibade Dora. Pumbura China Misawa Soba Tendere Dame Dora. It does a Dame by Imbanashi Korakai, but the Tonga Yunaso, Musum Tonga Yunasigora. Timalura Tambanese, Eugenelu Midabada Dames on Yila, Tenga Nelo, Lo Matuve Tonas, Lo Matuve Tona, Beba Meba Tor, you and Bezo Geshe, over nature kind, but the Tambune Tonde do Asigora. And it seems that Bamedo Torta Guru Tikaji Zabara. Musumla now Chingi and Medapata Dunga Soba Kai, but it Benata de Sina, Rawa da Meva de Tondora, Raweta, Rawa Maimbe da de Tonguara, Rawa Maimbe da de Tonguara, Rawa Imbe da Toyomara. And Musumla now did the Tonde and Aniko, Beba Meba turned to us, 200 euros, Bezuka Shokumedua, Nobinelu. Kind but the Tonde do Asigora. Tachitangusum get Tona talking about your mother. Nana Nansora, Midaba Nansora. Tose your Marco. Kali and Yeshe to but and Jemito by Chiri Goda. You couldn't soon number Debbie and so sometimes you want to put the thought about the matter of thinking so much and Goda. Pinnacation. Tona Beme to draw a Juros in a Kaji Sobashera. Simjam Bame do draw a Tave came about the Taranlupa Lajagua. Oh, Simjam Bame do Bevache Megova to the Tokumares. Karasana. Sim de Tado Zimbala so by Ken Shangi and Nelo dele Coragues. So Samlo de Gomokanga Kaji Jigberan Shinjan de Tapan Zingiora. Time ever read the round with Tayaban Zingiora. Sim de Tado Zimbala soba, Mizala Town Zimbala soba, some loge. Nazunam do some Lutanda Conor and Weber Nature Chimachi Shimanzimaja Chinjilo Zindeora. Oh, Tiwange in the turtle with Mares order. Sim de Tado Zimbala soba, Ken Shangi, Nelu dele Coragusins, Ken Shandago Wange, Weber Nature Chimachi Shindele Chinjilo Duba, Goldu Race order, Chinjilo Zindu Race order. Dele Coragus. Ona tragi kele chove chu tawashindo ranglo don gyuroshina o tene kengi wange ta gasu ta ban zimbala soba kengi wange tende dendu ina ona tragi kele so ko tragi kengi wange gyandu to asigora kaji ona tragi kele jo Chu $1,000 doban euros. Chude me sabsone ya yushani ya tamuchandu gwa tenashi nyamola soba nega mebsone ya yanga suke ungurwaswa euroshenas kajun dobare odiskuna.
Oh, yeah. So here, then in this point of the extensive explanation, we have first this demonstrating the purity of mind here. And then the second is, and Rogers put this with the opponent's point, that teaching that stains are adventitious, sorry, yes, adventitious. I want to make sure I'm not saying advantageous. So here, the second point that it's taught that the stains are adventitious. So again, what has just been said is that all composite things, all of the forms and sounds and smells and tastes and touch that we experience, they are apprehended just as they are. So here, the opponent thinks then, well, if it is the case that all of these objects appear to our sense powers just as they are, and the stains are taught as being adventitious, as not in the nature of our mind. So the actuality of objects is impermanence, no self, etc. If that is seen from the beginning by an unmistaken mind, then one will be freed without effort. So if, as has just been asserted, that objects appear to us sort of by its own power, and we're able to see whatever it is that is appearing as that object, how is it that we don't recognize immediately from that, or sort of automatically, that there is no such autonomous self, because that's the nature of the object, right? So it should appear to us. And so why is it that we shouldn't just recognize that the aggregates are impure from the beginning, if it is the case that these stains are adventitious, and that objects are seen by an unmistaken mind, just as they are? So here, again, it is the case that when we see an object, we see that object as it appears, but there are things like its impermanence, which appear to us, that fact that it is disintegrating moment to moment, but we are unable to fully have certainty with regard to those. So here it says, it follows that there is not the problematic consequence that sentient beings are freed without effort, because they are diverted from this actuality by other conditions, such as self-grasping. So if something appears to us, it's not necessarily the case that we are going to perceive it just as it is. So here, although these sort of things appear to us in the way that they are, we are not necessarily able to recognize, say, their impermanence, and that they disintegrate moment to moment, but rather we hold them to be permanent. We are diverted, or sort of led astray from the actuality of the object by this grasping at permanence. Or similarly, when it comes to that which is actually suffering, we might hold it to be pleasant, because we are diverted from this actuality, from the reality of objects, by other conditions, such as self-grasping. So because of these adventitious stains, we are actually led astray from the kind of correct or understanding the actuality of objects. And so the opponent then comes back by saying, well, since stains arise through sudden conditions, or sort of through these haphazard conditions, they will return like the heat of water reboiled. So say you boiled some water and then you let it set for a while and it got cold. Well, you can reboil it. You can reheat that water. So this opponent thinks that, well, the stains arise adventitiously. So what is to say that they will not arise again?
Oh yeah. Tadi Zawadi Kenshan Gini Kuljusin Dra, Tonashi Namsa Tudu Marite Kenshan Yongi, Da Mebala Tadu Tawa, Medabala Tawa Tawa, Soba Kenshan Yongi, Chijilo do Kuewangi Totu Marisi, Zawadi Kenshan Gini Kuljusin, but still the Basha. Tachu Sawasin the Ranglo do Jurus Kajitsula, Taniba Ranglo do Juro Maris, Chipang Sasuna Yangasu, Ranglo and Lo Yongrisana, Teongrisana, or take Marisi. Ranglo and Jurusana. Then Dogbala Nikin La, Tambupan dogba de ko ken dame to be shirab yana yando kombala ten do rumato ko negap tagashi do shi yan chuke on get de mare sura ten dogba la ne yomo te dan dogba la ne ken dame to be shirab yane yando komne ngusum do to ba te yane yando komne ene dim gi ko do do go te sonja ko chu yangya lo yangya ke de ka bo de de ten dogba la ne ken dame to be shirab kombale te gwebe shirse. Tedara komna dodo mirunga mayin dese. Tedara komna dodo mirunga mayin dese. Tami tokbe sirab yani yandu kombala ten sigura. Tedara komna dodo mirunga mayin de tangjingi tsawa jen imbe midembe shirse. Tedara komna dodo yangyan dodo rungi mare tami tokbe sirab teta chakwa mebala soba tezun dodo runga mare se mirunga. Tendendo. Ten dogba ne ken dame to be shire komba la to be shira. Tedar komnan do nyumo teda sawa ne meban do mirwa ma ide so ten do. Tangzin ji sawa je yimbe meden be chis. Nyumo to ko tangbo yonsa te ta to jimbe ngobe ne so da mengen chinji lo ge samlu chile tene tel tene yongo ades gora. Dame komba de ngobe ne so da tumba yangdak ba chi lo yangdak ba yimbo komba tene yongo orba. Te sonja ko sawa ne meba so ne chi so so de yangja so lo ma de so na. Tene Teda gomna do miru maide tangzin gi tsawa chen be miten be shirisa ko tembu mares thakba le tuji lo shindos thakba le thakba thata re jebe je saraba ru be chile chine ni te tuiri samgirwa ni tuiri samne ko yabu jitane a de kujo ge medu samne tunji lo dun do ru ya yang ja tuiri samja samgu marno o tinashri o dishkur.
So here, then the response to this by Thabkhe, again, we're saying that although a cognition recognizes objects or apprehends objects as they are, we're diverted from that kind of correct cognition by other conditions. And so here, this continues by Thabkhe saying that again, responding to this idea that, well, if the stains are adventitious, then they can arise again, the way that we could reheat water. And so he responds, it is not the case that faults will return because their absence necessarily depends upon accustomation of the contradictory condition, the wisdom realizing no self. And so here we can, although we hold things to be permanent that are impermanent, and we are holding things that are impure to be pure, and so forth, due to these kinds of adventitious conditions. Once we have eliminated the basis for all of those, which is the grasping at a self, then it is definite that they're not going to arise again. There's no way for them to arise again because they are lacking a basis. So it says, if one accustomates that, it is not the case that it will be unsuitable that faults be absent. So basically, it is suitable that the faults be gone because they will be baseless since they have self-grasping as their root. So once we have, by first learning about selflessness and then meditating on it again and again, such that we gain a direct realization, and finally through stages, removing all of those obstacles completely, one attains a state where there is no re-arising of those stains. So the place that all of those came from was this grasping at a self. And once that grasping at a self has been removed, it is not something that is suitable to arise again. And this is due to its being in accordance with reality. When we have realized selflessness, we have come to an understanding that accords with reality, whereas our misperception of some kind of an autonomous self is something that is contrary to reality. So this is like, for example, the mind that sees a striped rope as a snake. When we have, say, we see like a coiled up rope that is striped sitting in a corner and we think that it's a snake, we can scare ourselves. But then once we realize that it's not a snake, there's no way that we're going to give rise to that idea that it's a snake again. We've eliminated that wrong idea such that it can't arise again. And this is again because it doesn't accord with reality.
Oh yeah, this is our dogma la ne ken la de meden tu ki lo shin de Numu Batazu Dodo de Tas Dodo Mares, Ken Damito Beshirabiana Yando Combalatone, and a Kongusum do Tone, Timai Bangusum do Shebekon and Dondo, retained Larian so, Chinjulo and K. Young Mares. Midden Trigiros a Pena, Tambu Turi, some Genor, Shema Trima Bangusum de Tonsona, Yanga de Taba the Turi, some Jingim Dwastin days, saw the one, Doval and Kenna to Midden Triglos notes. Oh, Tichilamna.
So here in the root verses, it says again that absence of faults depends on conditions. When the conditions are present, faults will be baseless, like the mind that sees a rope as a snake. So here, it's not as though it's just we sort of have the random arising of our various afflictions or the random removal of that, but rather they are undermined, they are removed by the correct understanding of selflessness. They're moved by their opposite. And once we have gotten rid of the kinds of conditions that lead to those faults, or sort of we've developed the conditions that lead to the absence of those faults, then they will become baseless, like the mind that sees a rope as a snake. Like if we misperceive a striped rope to be a snake, once we've realized, oh, that's not a snake, we don't give rise to the idea that it's a snake again. That has undermined our kind of perception.
Oh, yeah, that's some Geshe did it. Geshe, name your top simbe, and it Sheba de la Laria, Panja de Sulo Yungumares, the Geshe Casitanda do it, or some Botadonas. Oh, Sembi Ranshin Vesava in the Esse, Sembi Ranshin Vesava in the Tanzina Sobe Mimbe Chidar, Tiba Tedar Sembi Ranshila, Mashu. Oh, then Sembi Ranshin de Vesavades, Caresina. Tadun Zimba, Tamebala, Tadun Zimba, Mitabala, Taban Zimba, Mizala, San Zimbala, Soba, Sura, Tanzila, Sobe, Mimbe, Chita Triba Tedas, Tanda Cochinjulo, Zini, Tibi, Batedar, Simbi Ranshila, Mashushin, Comitabada, Tagbata, Tende Ranshin, Tendejurete, Yomarton, Pajo Yugi Ranshin, Tendejurete, Yomarton, Mashushin. Then Jibala Sobe Ranshin Bitcher, some big Yugi Ranshin, Mitabada, Jibber Ranshin, round the maybe Ranshin Bitcher. Me, then a Sembi Ranshin to me, take a rest in a Sembi Ranshin, Vesava said, then a Sembi Ranshin to me. Matibet, my English, Sembi Ranshin, till it to my shandaj only to give your Marset and it and the Maris and Bra. Then a Sembi Ranshin to me, Matibet, my English, similar Tanzingi, member Baba Tes, similar Yata, Mebala, Tayo, Zimbe, member Nashi Bab de Yorwa. No, that's a castle, Chinjuloche. Similar Tanzingi. Ta me bala ta yoban zimbe tangzin ki memba baba te se te rangshin la masuk beto ngobu koran la tende ngone jire de yo mares ngoy ne su tere de yo ma tere medu ne sheba de konzin te ya semla tangzin ki memba baba te rangshin la masuk beto yese shuna tangzin te rangshin la shoba ina ne yu de ya medabala takba yenguru medaba memba takba yenguru da meba mai barangya tu ta yo ba yengura ani te dan zimba de ko chinji malo ba re do gorwa te ne ko ne ta yo se tak ba yin se re do ra shuna se te ran shin la ten de shu de yo na re de yo na ne tang jin ji jin dan shem ji ne lu la chi de yo ba te dan tu ben tang jin ji zimba na shin ngo ben de su ya ta ga na se ne do re se te dan da me ba ma re ta yo ta tak ba yin se 친지로 좀만 시점 버는 거라 교로서 어디시 돈나
So
샘비랑
then
신고서 좀만 남는 루브로 왔어 야 알레 어디 돈이래
So then
뭐래
we come to a kind of a summary of this, and this comes in the line of 208 that says, "The nature of mind is clear light." And so here, this then describes that the nature of mind is clear light, because however much it is covered by the darkness of self grasping, etc., that self-grasping does not partake of the nature of mind. And because the mind has the nature of being perishable, and etc. So here, this although we grasp at that which is selfless as having some kind of a self, or that which is impure as being pure, that which is impermanent as having some kind of permanence, those types of misperceptions have not penetrated the nature of mind. They haven't entered into the nature of mind. And so this is something where we could also say they are not inherent to the mind, because the mind has a nature of being perishable, of being impermanent. And so in this way, the mind has the nature of not having such an autonomous existence as we perceive it to have. So, the nature of mind is not an object that is not covered by stains. So, we can see that there are times when these adventitious stains are able to sort of cover the mind. But the darkness of self grasping that has come over the mind does not partake of the nature of mind. If it did so partake, then the manner of grasping that grasps at a self would be in accord with how the mind actually exists. And so here, these sort of misperceptions, this grasping at things as permanent, which are actually impermanent, or apprehending some kind of a self in that which is selfless, these are not in the nature of reality. They don't accord with reality. And so, as that is the case, they don't sort of partake of the nature of mind as it describes it here. So, if it were the case that we were really perceiving the true nature of objects correctly when we perceive them to say have a self or be permanent, then it's as it continues in this last sentence there, if that were the case, there would be no self and a self would exist. So, if this were something that the self grasping or this kind of misapprehension were of the nature of mind, then we would have to posit based upon the fact that mind, as has already been asserted, to perceive objects correctly, we would have to say that there is such a self and there isn't selflessness.
Oh yeah. Chaso Jimanamni Chujin Yudelia Lagba Trotane Yudovan Sosolo, Patagio, Nesule Tendechivachina, Mikanga Chiba Tongre, Tongio Mara, Condre Yude, Sosolo, Batsimi Jig, Namdo Trotane, Comito, Tongio Armato, Nesule Tendene, Mikanga, Tende Tongre, Tongio Mara. Chaso Jimanamni Chujo Lubro, I in the essay. Simki Nelula Lobar Suber, Loin Besses. Simco Mobu Pietoya de Chinchilo Tongo Retender, Simge Kurangi Nelulaya, and a Lobar Suber Lottes, Sim Tagba La Soba Tende Toyoto, Tusum Bigger. Nelula Lobar Suber Loin Bishire. Tuichi Nebatina maybe Nebutani don't give a semlas. Tuichi so dame bangusum do to Rawa. Talk with this or nay, you're a couple of single. Tuichi Nebatina maybe Nebutogi Tani do Gurbe Semla, Nebati never made a young Yako, Tameto Musum do talk by Chelia, young yet Tanzila soba, Chagala soba, soon never young Mares, Taloshan. Karasana Nara, Pumbusa Nara, then Toba Samba Chebe Kablia, Pumbulia. Round the meba, la Toba than Sambache, and coming Tarmusum to Tokyo, no. The Nara Pumbula Tosam Gay, Chongbe, Tunaya, so what to do in Aya, Tanzil, Tami, Tokbeshira, the Pan, Madon, Jumbe Niba, Yormado, Tanzingi, Tami, Tokbeshira, the two and Jumbe Niba, Yomares. Ke mana ni tandang ngusum to toni tende komba chebatelia, sunne ba de yung mares. Te sawa de tremanam ni lubro asera. Tisingaya new minas ngara pumbulia den toba dan samba chebe negab langusum to mato ba negab naya ane tangzing gi tame dog besera tujung samjung lo chu negu mena tandang ngusum to chadu tele jan negu mar teta jula chini mese teta nenjur tomne chisu ane ngusum to dog bejulia su yangja lo yande kaba yung de yung mare sung do oh this kuna sawa den yigan yamta.
So, So here, then again, it says that the stains of attachment, etc., are adventitious because they are based upon minds that partake of the inverse of the actual nature of mind. So here, like when we see like our stains of attachment and anger and so forth, these are not kind of minds that accord with reality. For example, when we're really angry at somebody, we engage in this kind of thinking that exaggerates flaws, that projects things where they are not there. And so this is the kind of a way in which our adventitious stains like attachment and anger and so forth partake of the inverse of the actual nature of mind. They are not in accord with the way that things actually are. And so this there is in a mind that has become in the nature of the antidote that negates those flaws, no capacity for generating those flaws at a later time. Because even earlier, when one is training in study and reflection about the aggregates, that self-grasping has no capacity to destroy the wisdom realizing no self. So here, when it comes to the kind of wrong views that we hold to, or the sort of afflictions and so forth, these do not accord with reality. So when one has developed this antidote that negates those, you come to a point where there's no capacity for generating those flaws at a later time. And so we can see how this is when we are engaged in study and reflection on selflessness, and we're doing this sort of investigation or contemplation. That wisdom realizing selflessness, even conceptual, is not able to be harmed by our self-grasping. Those, as it says here, that self-grasping has no capacity to destroy the wisdom realizing no self. So when we have developed this kind of wisdom realizing no self, there's no way that it can be harmed by our flaws. So again, the root verse here says, the nature of mind is clear light. These stains are adventitious. There is, in one who has become the nature of the antidote, no capacity for those faults later, because even earlier, they have no capacity.
Oh, yeah. Taniba, you can answer. Oh, Tanda Larineba Keba, you can Yurimbune to Maresgora. Oh, did it what you got us now? Chirme on Sujansa. Tanya Dulia, Chirme on says you're no. Kinshu says Chiron, Chirme on says. Chirme on says, then Debe come the girl and the Chiron. Pagbatele Chiron Sora. Chirme on says, Uncle Pagba Lamtomne. Nadu Debe come the Dangam the girl Lamba Surme also the Chirme on Segora. Sungam Dantil Lamba Yordo. Chirme on or the Pagbat Nadu Chirme on the Chujan Sora. Semla Neba gave a Nuba Yuna Yasa. Chirmo Damu Musum to Tosari, in a Tanda Yamuchazan Payomare. Musum to Toyo, in a Town in Yaba Payomare. Did Semla Neba gave a Nuba Yuna Yasa. You don't never Yuba mind, Tanyamo, Yumo de Congress Semla, you don't never Yomare. Carisna. Tanzila never change it. Daming Musum to Toba de Kebe, never corner condia pendula, Musum to Ton and Tanda Kajiri Tandaya, never conda pendula, meeting show the man, never Yam drama to Yamardo. Tanzila never change it. Daming Musum to Toba Kebe, never to Jenda, Nimbu changing over Cuba. Dame Bade, Coning Bungo Nezu than Tumba or no. Or this was until I went to net to Marta. Tanzida never chasso to the using Buneg Martin Joba Trashing Bedriver Tom do this and go. Bena Salon La, Salon Bala may using to Minebashino, Salon by Sametana, Salon Bay, Chuti Wanganico, Medine Togmar, Tina Shiriese. Oh, this all the name to Lapsana. Timana Lugating and South Coalition. Oh, did I? New Naya never chance. Can you Bushangula? Similar never given Nuba under Yuna Yaskura Chirmolia. New Naya, never chance. You didn't do net to Madagascar, Tanzilia, Nuba, and Tamito Beshira, given Nuba to Genti or Esura. New Naya, never chance. Can you Bushangula? You do net, you would never made it. Sunderland mission started to go. Oh, teach you.
So then we turn to second here, even if there is a fault, some kind of fault, the impossibility of its remaining for a long time. So here it says then in the commentary on 419, a non returner's mind, even if there does exist in it the capacity for generating fault, does not have the capacity to make them remain a long time because it exists as an entity that has the force and nature that has the capacity, has the power to generate the wisdom realizing no self, which damages self grasping. So, here again, in terms of the Shravaka and Pratyeka Buddha paths, there are various kind of levels of attainment, including an entry to the stream winner, attaining the fruit of a stream winner, a once returner and non-returner, and then an arhat. And here we're talking about what is referred to as a non-returner. So a non-returner means that they are no longer going to take rebirth in the desire realm. Although it may be possible for them to take rebirth in the form and formless realms, they will no longer, they're called a non-returner because they're not going to return to the form realm. And so they have achieved the level of an Arya, of having had a direct realization of emptiness, but they haven't yet removed all of the faults completely. But because they have attained this state of an Arya, they have developed the capacity of that wisdom realizing emptiness, and such have generated this kind of entity that has the force and the nature that has the capacity or the power to generate the wisdom realizing no self. So this is the kind of power that they have generated based upon developing this wisdom of no self that accords with reality. And because it accords with reality, again, it is unable to be sort of damaged by any kind of grasping at some sort of a self. And so the example that they give here is then, for example, it is like fire, which cannot remain burning for a long time on damp ground. So because this non-returner has developed the power of this wisdom realizing emptiness directly, even if throughout the rest of the progression, some sort of slight faults arise, they don't have the capacity to remain long. Just like if you try to light a fire on a damp ground, that's not going to be able to remain burning.
Oh yeah, Taniba Tajumba Nenju top Sasuna, and a young Yeba de Lard Dogre Senatin, the Dogbe top Sigma race, top Sigma race, Tishigwa. Tajumba Church and Yeba Chaso Logbe Chitu, Beba Majisha, Tajum Chane, Chagna Pansare, Tangzin Pansaduza, Yangako Keg, Toshi Sigma race. Tajumba Church and Yeba Chaso. Logbe chido yangya kyalo chene kek chido beba meche chinse beja lo minute sen bezo cheba yene kotsu ke yo mare dame ba ngusung do to ni komba tar chen chadu za ngoro tagin ga zo di tagda tu mai ba ngusung do she chadu yangya tagda tu re sam jine jine je yo mar to odina shire neba chaso logbe chido beba meche chen beja lo minute se gejen kowe nyeze tamje mebar Gajan Korean Yeshe, Danji, Dan Dosha, Dan Kondo, Dangaja, Chadola Soba, Assembly, I give you Maba Chasare, Gangang Maba Chasare, Lam Gom Gom, the Kale Mambu Jamira. Gajan Korean Yeshe, Tamja Mabra Yanda Beton, Dame Beton, Musum to talk by Tami, Musum to Tony, Tiane and Comne, Tadikase, Tachum Sarwa. Rangi Julu, Nabakundu, Tesho, Zimbashe, Kadu Namking Arazunanga, Samsung Anjing Kunelane, and Doya, Dewan Toya Tapshiche, Tunga Tapshiche, Sedeoto, Dajumba to the Kaduinako, Da Meba, Musum do Tony, Cheto, Negapes in the odd Da Meba, Musum do some location Dura. Namking Samsung Dwana Shaw, Tinga, Meba. Musum do Tony, Tona, Shani, Cheto, Negap Soti, Niba Manya Bacheko. Tony Rashi Rawa to Tibeta Mason to Nang Deveris Tonche, and it's simply charging the oh, did Tame Dangusum to talk by Rangi number Kundu Te Chons in Bishers. Te Chicken Naming are Lutambu Shes in Bataru, Tati Lutambu Yege, Rigi Capsuchi Shets and Sardo. Oh, they do Carsoda. Oh, yeah, the Lamna do matter. So I made a yanda to Sawadira. Sawa meda yanda to ngo ni la chinlo kin be du sinja mendo de lo ne de shon rin chi ro se da de sawa de do ko yen ye se tam je me ba re yang nu shi cha ro sawa meda yanda be to ngo sum du tong sa re do to ne sawa meda yanda to ngo ni la chinlo je be du sinja mendo de yang ja nyomo ke tab li yang be na ti ma re se ka se ne lo ngo sum du sin to cha ni mai ba Tilo cheba shukchimbu manya bacha lo tu namba kundu te chonzi nete yore sungro. Oh, this too na duation.
So then we turn to the impossibility of there being a method of reversing a complete abandonment. So here, the subject in Arhat does not try to restore the faults of attachment, etc. And even if they do try, they do not have the capacity to restore those mistaken attitudes, because the independent thought in their mind stream that realizes perceptually and naturally the correct object, no self, apprehends in that way in all respects without being harmed at all by the proximity of its contradictory condition, samsara. So here, when it comes to in Arhat, it's not as though they would try to restore the faults of attachment and etc. But even if they do, they're unable to generate those again, because one has developed this wisdom realizing no self. And that is something that is not sort of harmed by those wrong attitudes, those sort of contradictory conditions. So, like in the way that if we have come to understand and know completely that that striped rope is not a snake, then we're not going to give rise to that wrong understanding again. And so, too, when it comes to an arhat, if one, even if they sort of for some reason wanted to give rise to afflictions again, that would be something that is impossible, because this attitude, this wisdom, realizing selflessness that has been developed, such that they have a direct realization within meditative equipoise. But even when they come out of that in the periods of what we call subsequent attainment, the kind of understanding carries on that all phenomena are selflessness. There's no such self from its own side. And they're in that way completely without being harmed by contradictory conditions. So here, the root verse then says, even if one does try, one is not able to restore mistaken attitudes, because thought that cognizes naturally the correct object apprehends in that way completely without being harmed by contradictory conditions. So once one has developed this wisdom realizing selflessness to the point when that it is a direct realization, and also during those periods of subsequent attainment, it is such that it's unable to be harmed by the kind of contradictory condition of no self. And again, this is because it accords with reality.
Oh, yeah, that's this one. No, that is it.
So that's good for today. We've reached the end of our time. So we'll stop there for today's session.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's